Thank you for sticking around for our concluding discussion. Before we launch in, I think it's important to thank our organizers, in particular Dr. Elizabeth Anthony, and all of my former, current, it's always hard when you leave an institution, colleagues at the USHMM for pulling together this very important conference. My name is Dr. Robert Williams. I am the Director for Countering Anti-Semitism and Violent Extremism at Human Rights First. I'm also the Chair of the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial at the 33-Nation International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. The subject of our chat today, our final chat today, will be how and why we need to integrate better study of the Holocaust with study of the refugee and migrant experience. The fact that we're having this panel discussion is somewhat remarkable in and of itself. To the casual observer, it might seem that the fields are already integrated. After all, many of our contemporary institutions, such as the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees, which has its anniversary in 2 days, were built with the Holocaust and the immediate post-Holocaust experiences in mind. Even more so, particularly at this time of year, we recognize events that include the turning away of the St. Louis from American shores 80 years ago, the immorality of the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, or we can just visit the exhibition that's about 100 feet away from us to realize that at times we fall short of our own ideals. But as with so many things, there are silos even within academia, and these two subjects often do not intersect. The experiences of victims and survivors as migrants and as refugees can get lost very easily amidst all the other horrors of the age. And the fact that the international community was either incapable or indifferent to take action still needs interrogation and analysis. Where did it fall short and why? Questions like this are really only beginning to be asked, in part thanks to the efforts of some of the people who will soon speak. The value of developing dialogue between Holocaust studies and migration/refugee studies is essential for a host of reasons, many which lie beyond mere academic curiosity. As mentioned earlier today during our survivor discussion, we're witnessing a series of overlapping migration and refugee crises all around the world. As one disappears, another pops its head, and we often find ourselves asking one essential question that was posed by Austrian refugees in the late 1930s. Was sollen wir tun? So, what will we do? Well, we must first ask ourselves if we recognize the moral imperative to accept migrants fleeing dangerous situations, and if we do, then we must consider how to bring them into our national contexts, and then consider how a moral leadership might act in the face of such crises. To arrive at answers to these questions, we need to know what our forebears did or did not do. And some of the lessons from the Holocaust or the immediate post-Holocaust era can point the way. Today, organizations like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum provide opportunities to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust, including these, are not lost. But this is a significant challenge. Civil servants, diplomats, and human rights leaders must be made more aware of the lessons from this period. Those lessons are relevant to their work today, and they're also relevant to the work of international agencies that are tasked with caring for refugees. Of course, it's tremendously selfish of me to say that historical knowledge is a panacea. I was trained as an historian after all, and if you're a hammer, every problem is a nail. But there's clearly a need to engage more, to learn more, and to build dialogue around these issues, both within our country and on the international stage, as well as between academic fields. Now, it's going to be the responsibility of the panelists to help point the way. You've heard biographies of two of our panelists, but they are, in order of speaking, Debórah Dwork, Gerhard Baumgartner, Brigitte and Alan Lichtblau. They're going to speak in this order, followed by a brief moderated discussion at the end, so I'm going to ask that you keep your questions until they conclude. Gerhard and Brigitte have already had their introductions, so I'll start with Debórah. Debórah Dwork is the founding director of the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and the inaugural Rose Professor of Holocaust History at Clark University. She has several award-winning books, including Children with a Star, which introduced a child-centered approach to this subject, and her Flight from the Reich, which is important for today's discussion, which integrated the refugee experience into Holocaust history. Debórah is internationally renowned for her scholarship and envisioned and grew the Strassler Center into an eminent institute for doctoral training in Holocaust study and in genocide studies. She and I are colleagues at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, where she chairs the academic working group. And she has been, among other things, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and a Fellow of the American Council for Learned Societies. Most recently, Debórah served as the Shapiro Senior Scholar in Residence here at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. Alan Lichtblau is Vice Chair of the Center for Jewish Cultural History and Professor and Chair in the Department of History at the University of Salzburg. He previously served as a research associate at the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism at the Technische Universität Berlin and in the Institute for Jewish History at St. Pölten in Austria. His fields of expertise include Jewish studies, genocide and migration studies, oral history, and audiovisual history. Professor Lichtblau holds degrees in history and political science from the University of Vienna. And with that, we'll start with Debórah. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, Mike. I thought you meant the clicker. Sorry. Not enough coffee in the afternoon.
Thank you. I don't need the clicker because I will not present a PowerPoint. I am the PowerPoint. You will, right, I'll just leave it there. So I too thank you, Rob, for that wonderful introduction. I thank the organizers of this conference. Thank you so very much. And I also thank every single person who is in a seat now for your, not for your perseverance, which is what Rob was thanking you for. I thank you for your engagement, your commitment, your interest. We share that passion, and I am delighted to be in such good company. So my role in this wonderful round table is to shift the frame from Austria and the United States to a broader lens, to situate the history of refugee Jews as an integral strand in the history of the Holocaust. Now, this may seem obvious, but until recently, the scholarly literature advanced a different view, distinguishing the two as separate fields of human experience. Most histories of the Holocaust marginalize or indeed even elide the refugee story entirely, while histories of refugees focus on departure and new lives with a mere nod to the Holocaust context. And I know I'm guilty of this too. Rob mentioned my first book on the history of the Holocaust, which was called Children with a Star. And my original plan had been to include the history of Jewish children as they fled Nazi Europe. But in the end, it seemed to me that their experiences were another story. And I did not include that original material. It was useful later. I came back to it when I wrote Flight from the Reich. But the point is that I did not see my way to integrating those histories. And it really took me years to step back far enough to capture the whole picture, to gain the lateral vision that allowed me to see centrifugal movements from the center, from the core, from Nazi Europe, to points all over the globe, to see all of that centrifugal movement as one pattern, one experience. So, now I find it pretty odd that this blind spot with regard to those who flee, it appears to be unique to the Holocaust. Human rights activists, scholars, reporters identify those who fled for their lives in Darfur, for example, or in Rwanda. They identify those who fled for their lives, first of all, as victims, second, as survivors, if indeed they did survive, but certainly as subjects in the genocide story, while the very same had not applied to the Holocaust. Okay. My point, of course, is that had Jews not sought asylum, they too would have been caught in the murder network. And fleeing does not write refugees out of the story. It simply takes the story elsewhere. Indeed, it takes it everywhere around the globe. Locating our work in the growing field of immigrant refugee studies also highlights the agency of desperate people caught in constantly shifting situation and how they found tiny cracks in an otherwise closed world. So, Anna Frank. Anna Frank's family history serves as an example for us. Anna Frank, probably the most famous, certainly the best loved refugee Jew, is rarely coded as a refugee at all. This came to the fore in 2004 when Dutch TV aired a program to elect the greatest Dutch person. I'm not kidding, I can't make this stuff up. One of the top 10 was Anna Frank. Of course, she never held Dutch citizenship. Now, if the Dutch no longer recall that Anna was a German Jewish refugee, it is not surprising that no one else does either. My point here is that her history in hiding, followed by deportation and death, elides her family's early response to Nazi persecution. Yet it is most probable that it was precisely the family's status as refugee Jews from Germany that prompted Otto to prepare his family's hiding plans sooner than his Dutch co-religionists who later sought to disappear. So let's go through this. German Jews held a more vulnerable position than Dutch Jews after the Germans occupied the Netherlands in May 1940. They were ordered to register and were specially targeted in violent raids in February and then again in June 1941, when all non-Dutch Jews had to report for voluntary emigration in December 1941. Otto Frank, by then stateless like all German Jews, may well have realized that this was a charade. There was no place anywhere that anyone wanted to go. And he was right. The first transports from the Netherlands to death camps in the East were filled with German Jews. In short, his experience as a refugee framed his interpretation of events on the ground as they unrolled. So let's move to a more obvious refugee experience, slipping across borders in the middle of the Holocaust. The context. July 1942. Swiss Army intelligence reported increasing numbers of Jewish refugees from the Netherlands and Belgium stealing into Switzerland. All of these people leave their countries for the same reason, to escape the work camps to which they are sent by the occupation power, the intelligence service reported. The Swiss leadership had no illusions about the nature of those work camps. Yet, they said, Switzerland was in a struggle for its very existence. Roused by the numbers, and as the leadership put it, the character of infiltration, more and more organized and coordinated by professional passeurs, the government demanded action. Chief of Police Rothmund promptly called for the ruthless expulsion of refugees, and I quote, even when the foreigners who are involved will incur risk of life and limb. That's the context. Now a family. Leah and Simon Sonnabend and their children, Charles and Sabine. When Sabine got called up for forced labor in Poland, her family promptly left their home in Brussels on August 9, 1942. Her father, a watch wholesaler, had good contacts in Switzerland. Simon also had a Swiss bank account with a sufficient sum to see them safely through the war. This family of four entered Switzerland on August 12 and stayed in a small house in a forest for 2 days, expecting someone to collect them. It was while they waited that Rothmund ordered the police to seal the border. The Sonnabends went to Bienne, where Simon's business partner, Ernst Schneeberger, welcomed them warmly. None of them knew then that Rothmund had ordered the police to throw out undocumented refugees. When Schneeberger tried to register the Sonnabends officially, the authorities responded by arresting them. Obeying Rothmund's instructions, District Commander Sergeant Chauffat took the decision to return the family to the border that very evening. Schneeberger jumped to their rescue, but Chauffat refused to reconsider. At 9 p.m., he collected Simon and Leah, who began to scream, "This is our death! This is our death!" Passers-by heard her, and about 50 people surrounded Chauffat's car. Overcome by pity, Chauffat reported, the public protested the refoulement. In order to prevent a riot, Chauffat took the Sonnabends to prison. But theirs was a short reprieve. Police, dressed in civilian clothes, collected the family, brought them to the border by taxi, and pushed them across. The border crossing went very well, Chauffat reported to his superior the next morning. The costs of the taxi and the escort were paid by the party themselves. For the Sonnabends, refoulement spelled the end. Caught by German patrols, parents and children were separated. Simon and Leah were put on train number 23 to Auschwitz the next day. Leah was gassed upon arrival, Simon soon thereafter. The Germans sent Charles and Sabine to an orphanage run by the French Jewish Council. The transit camp of Drancy was full, so the children, who were slated for deportation, remained in the orphanage and survived. Refugees, victims, survivors. One family, one history. Tracking the history of refugees, families like the Sonnabends, individuals like some of you here today, and integrating their experiences yields a richer, more complex, more nuanced history of the Holocaust, widening our lens and thus our understanding.
Thank you very much. I wanted to raise 3 points that have to do with Austrian refugees and with the refugee question in current days. The first one concerns actually our knowledge of the arrival of Austrians here in the States. I've been spending the last 3 weeks meeting people from former Austria, families, and I'm trying to trace here a pattern. It seems that there were players in the political field here in the United States that had a certain influence on what was happening. I'm talking in this case that I'm looking into about a very important trade unionist, the president of a union, who managed to, I've spoken to 4 families with concerning 19 people altogether, but apparently there are many more who managed to get visas in 1938, 1939 for lots of people that he was in a way, even if distantly, related to. He came from former Croatia, but his family stemmed from Austria, and he had made his career in the States since the 1920s. And he seems to have used his political influence to enable whole families to come to the United States as refugees, immigrants, whatever. It's not so quite clear. So I think there is a lot that we have to go into in order to understand how the escape, the rescue really worked. This is one of the projects that I would like to look into in the future. The second one is, I think, that when we look at the documentation of Austrian Jews escaping the territory of the Third Reich, and the materials that we have, the documentation that we have, also the research that we have, basically we can see that the old East-West division of before 1989 is still very present in this field. We have in Austria very good documentation about Austrian Jews in exile in most of the Western European countries, in the United States, in South America, in Canada, etc. We have nothing about Hungary. There is not a single publication about Austrian Jews fleeing to Hungary. There's no monograph about that. We have very little research. There is now some about Austrian refugees in the former Czechoslovakia. Even the exile of political opponents to Nazism and former Social Democrats is not really well documented in Czechoslovakia, what happened there, so there is a lot more material that could be looked into. About Yugoslavia, we have some research, but it concerns certain well-documented cases, but there is no overview really what happened there. So I find it very interesting that we still have these lacunae, which we have not been able to fill in the last years. And in this respect, and this leads me to my third point, because it concerns non-Jewish refugees, it concerns another group that I've been sort of researching for a long time, Roma and Sinti, the so-called gypsies. We know, the second group, as most of you know, who were, so to speak, victims of the Nuremberg laws, so victims of racist persecution. Many of them tried to escape. Many of them did actually escape, to all kinds of countries. Their research is really just at the beginning. I've just about now found the very first case where somebody was convicted by a Nazi court for helping so-called gypsies to escape across the border into Hungary. There is a lot of Hungarian material on the Hungarian side, but there's been no systematic research. I find this very important because also the persecution, discrimination, but I think we can say persecution of Roma and Sinti, especially in Eastern Europe, is a very current problem. And many of the things that we have seen in the interwar years in these countries that happened to Roma and Sinti have happened or are hopefully not in the same extent. Atrocities being carried out against Roma and Sinti, especially in Hungary, right down to murder cases, have made it a very current topic again. A very current topic, so that after some murder cases in Hungary in 2015, there was a whole wave of Roma and Sinti refugees, for example, into Canada, which had a very liberal policy towards refugees at that time. And I think these two problems are really interconnected, and I think that an understanding of the policy towards Roma and Sinti in the interwar years and also the persecution by Nazis and their collaborators will help us understand what is going on there today and why refugees from these countries, from these ethnic groups, really need help, and that this is a problem that Europe, but not only Europe, will have to deal with in the next years.
Sorry, going to sleep. I'm sorry, I prepared yesterday during the flight, and there was no possibility to print anything. I want to say a few words and point out some facts to the research on Austrians in exile by the Documentation Center, and from there I want to go on to some points where I think some new or more detailed research would be necessary. The Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance was founded by Herbert Steiner, who himself had survived the National Socialist persecution in Great Britain. His parents couldn't escape, his parents were murdered in Riga. And therefore, Herbert Steiner, when he returned to Austria, he made his PhD in history, and he had, first of all, good contacts to many people having survived in Great Britain, and Austrians in exile were an important topic for Herbert Steiner. And therefore, we, the Documentation Archive, I'm retired, it's my successor, but I still say we have a large collection on material about Austrians having been evicted and of organizations of Austrians in their new home countries. And that brings me to the point that the research on the so-called exile of the Documentation Archive started with a view on those refugees who founded organizations. There were, for instance, in Great Britain, two organizations, one of the Social Democrats, the Austrian Labour Club, and another one of the very large communist group of refugees, the Austrian Center. Herbert Steiner himself was member of the youth organization of the Austrian Center, Young Austria. And they had even publications, they had newspapers, we have them in our archive, in our library, and they give an impression of how how these refugees felt, and it strikes me that these people, they were evicted from Austria, but for instance, they did folk dance evenings in London to make Britain understand that there's a different Austria, another Austria, not a National Socialist Austria, and it's really touching. We have similar things from Austrians in Sweden we have very funny pictures from Austrians in Sweden with leather trousers and dirndl and hopping around and doing Schuhplattler. It's a sort of, I don't know how to explain, it's a sort of alpine folk dance. There are brochures, beautiful, we have one in our exhibition, in Vienna, beautiful Austria, with a picture of the mountains on the cover, and inside it's a praise of Austria and its cultural advantages, and I think that shows the very, very ambivalent feeling many of these refugees had against their former home country. Many of these in Great Britain, as well from the United States, returned home after 1945, weren't welcome in Vienna, weren't welcomed in Austria, or it was a difficult situation for them. But they wanted to do their part to rebuild Austria, like many others had volunteered for the British Army, for the US American Army to help liberate their country. So that's if talking about Austrians in exile, there are very different groups. There are those who are very politically engaged. There were those who wanted to help. There were those who were deeply disappointed and didn't want to hear anything from Austria anymore. And there were people like the woman who we have in the documentation archive a large collection of oral history, biographical, but only audio tapes. It was too expensive in the 80s to have videotapes. We couldn't afford that. And of the basis of that interviews, we did some publications, and one publication deals, it's called Jewish Fates, Jüdische Schicksale, and we talked to the people. We took their interviews into that book. And just to show the difficulty of these people, one day a woman, I didn't know her face, entered my office and said, okay, it's her name, and she is one of the young people we have in the publication. She fled to then Palestine, and nowadays lived in Israel. And we talked about the publication and about the interview, and suddenly she started to cry. And I said, what's wrong? Frau Granot, what's wrong with you? She said, I'm the first time again in Vienna. It's my home, but I couldn't live there anymore. And I think that brings the problems many of these people have with their former country. And that leads me to the second point I want to make. Frau Granot is a good leading point. I think there are a lot of research to be done, like Gerhard Baumgartner said already, and I think there are many. We should have more detailed research. We should have more knowledge how people dealt with the situation in the exile. It was a difficult situation, and 2 years ago for a symposium, I looked a little bit up in our collection of interviews and in the literature. How did women cope? And in the meantime, there's a lot of research going on that topic. But I want to end to say it were the women. They had the flexibility, they had the toughness, and they found themselves in exile in a very strange situation in using the skills which women are supposed to have because they are women, the female role model. And with these skills, they took over a role usually done by men. they earn the money for the living of the family. There are many, many cases, there are prominent cases. For instance, the wife of Berthold Viertel, a famous famous poet, Elisabeth Neumann Viertel, she herself was an actress before going to the United States. There, she and her siblings collected money to get the parents to the United States and supported the parents. And then they came to know Berthold Viertel. Berthold Viertel was unable to do anything except writing, and she supported him as well. For instance, to get back to the, that was in New York, another woman who was a very impressive woman, I knew her, was Clementine Zernig. She was one of the first female lawyers in Vienna in the pre-war time. She got to the United States with her husband. Her husband, again, couldn't cope with the new situation. She later said the hate of Hitler gave her the strength to do what she did. She helped, she was a housemaid. Later on, she was secretary to an aristocratic Austrian exile organization with Janine. And then she ended up as a librarian. But she had the strength, she coped, she made it. And a last example for the flexibility of women, we talked about it at lunch. A family tried to escape and just made it to Gibraltar, and from there on they wanted to go to Latin America. That didn't materialize, they ended up in Africa. But in the meantime, they had to earn a living. So the wife decided she put up a little kiosk in Gibraltar, cooked coffee and baked Apfelstrudel. And on that way, the family survived. And I think we should, when dealing with exile, we should honor the flexibility, the toughness, the creativity many, many women developed in coping with that situation, in fitting in helping, in supporting, in some cases, the whole family. And I think that would be a good topic for further research. Thank you.
Okay, let me just start to thank you for the organizations, for the Museum and Dokumentationszentrum. I'm very honored to be here with so many important colleagues. Gerhard asked me to tell you a little bit about the Austrian Heritage Collection. So it's a specific project running in New York at the Debórah Institute. And I just want to show a little bit how it came to that and why it looks like this. So I was working in New York in the early 1990s at the Debórah Institute, working on the memoir collections, and I found out that the Debórah Institute mainly is an archive for German Jews, for survivors in these years. And I was, during this time, I met many survivors. I started to do interviews, not for a project, just because of my own interest. So, and it was a travel throughout the world and throughout New York. So I think I did each day another interview, not knowing why I'm doing this. But if you do this, you see so many, private museums. I don't have to tell you, everybody knows this here. And so many documents and so many photos and so many life stories. So I really got depressed. There was the Dokumentationsarchiv, but nobody was here in the States. So I was thinking of we have to do something about this. Because this was the early 90s. In the 90s, many things happened in this perspective, like the museum here, or the National Fund for the Victims of National Socialism in Austria, or the Gedenkdienst. You just mentioned it this morning, so somebody sitting here for the Gedenkdienst, the memorial service, and working here. So, we suddenly had a setting which we could use, because my idea at the first moment was, we have to start a project. But it wouldn't have been a good idea to start a project in Austria and ask people in the States, to provide archival material. So, I mean, I don't have to tell you why. We had Waldheim, we had Haider, so Austria had not a very good reputation, and there were good reasons not to talk to us. Anyway, so finally we were able to design a kind of setting. So most important that somebody is here all the time. We asked the Leo Baeck Institute, and they were willing to, to provide workspace for this. So we could encourage the Gedenkdienst. They just started in '92, so the first Gedenkdiener was sent to Auschwitz. So these were only a few years after, so I asked them if they, could think of another position at the Leo Baeck Institute. Okay, this worked out, and then we needed the national fund. So, and we needed support from the states, from the Austrian Cultural Forum, so everything was settled. Sounds good to me so far. But then you have to think, how can you arrange this? So the idea was the national fund, you could apply for not a big sum, but you could apply, and it was not very bureaucratic to get some kind of money, whatever you call it, it's of restitution or so ever. So the idea was that the national fund sends out initial letters to those who applied, because data are very private, so we had a big concern about this also. So they did really send out the initial letter to those who applied, and this was excellent for us because we then had one or two young people from Austria sitting at the Leo Baeck Institute and waiting for responses. And the response was breathtaking. So we never expected to get so many responses. But I think the good thing was that it was situated not in Austria, it was situated here in the States. So all what was provided to somebody else, was kept here. And I think this was very important. It was very important that young people from Austria were there and were, calling, and if somebody called, just made sure that they have an interest in the stories of the survivors. So this was, for me, the most important part almost of that project. It was not, catching so much material as possible. It was also about the dialogue. You have a chance to talk to each other. And, especially the elderly generation of survivors really love to talk Austrian German. And so it's specific, as you know. And I mean, the other way around, it was just wonderful to listen to these survivors speaking in an Austrian German of the 1930s. It's a wonderful language. We don't have it anymore. And, it's really, it's unique. And it's just, okay. So this is the background, more or less. The project is still going on, and I'll just give you the numbers, what came out. Nowadays, they have more than 1,300 collections, which means people provided documents to the archive. So the Leo Baeck Institute now is really Austrianized, which is nice. Well, it's good. We made it. I think it's good for both sides. One of the important things was also that the young people go out and do interviews. I mean, there was a big discussion at the Leo Baeck Institute. Why is this important? Because, it's very difficult to preserve this kind of material, and if you're not used to it, okay. Anyway, but for us it was so important that people go out and, meet people. So nowadays there's almost 700 interviews from that project. And I said, we have an initial letter, so it was just a letter, and we asked people to just fill out some basic information. The most important question there is, before you came to the United States, did you live somewhere else? And this showed us, transmigration. This was really breathtaking for me because I didn't know that it took many people so long and so many steps to come here, And then we asked, are you willing to fill out a second questionnaire? And the second questionnaire was much more extensive. So we wanted to initiate that people write, respond to certain questions with their own words. So it's not about, okay, yes or no. So please tell us an example, for instance. So the first questionnaire was approximately 3,700 people responded to the project, and half of them, so more than almost 1,800, filled out the second questionnaire. I'm sure many more wanted to do this, but it's a very, it's really work if you do this. I mean, but now we have this material, and it's just wonderful because. Think of this, you have one question and you have 1,500 responses. And this really makes this project so fascinating to me. And I'm just looking, okay, I'll give you two examples. You mentioned, you used the word nuances, and this is what you really can do with this material. I'll just give you one example. It's at the questionnaire, we also asked about anti-Semitism. Did you experience anti-Semitism? And one woman, Charlotte, responded, she was born 1904, not at all. So no anti-Semitism. She didn't experience anything. But we also have an interview with her, and there the same question almost, did you experience anti-Semitism? She said, not personally, but Vienna was anti-Semitic. I mean, you could hear this word Sauerjud, like Jewish pig. This was an everyday term. So we have the same question in a different setting. And I think this is very important to get aware if we have, projects where you can just respond with yes or no, to be careful that if somebody says no, it doesn't mean that there was no knowledge about it, or, even if you didn't experience it physically, everybody knew about it and it shaped your life. And as you said before, we also, because this is important, about the relationship to Austria, about return journeys. So there's a very detailed question about return journeys, and I just have to check it out, if I can find it. I think this is very important. The return journeys are very important. As you said, the beauty. People, even in the papers then, they were writing about the beauty. And this is really not so nice about Austria because it's too beautiful if you really, are kicked out of the country, because this is what stays. But on the other hand, it gives you a chance, also there's something important because you felt home there. And these are your roots, more or less. And I work on return journeys very much, and I think that's very, very important. But for instance, we have the numbers that in our project, only 10% of those who responded, and I'm sure many people did not respond at all, but of those who responded, 10% never went back to Austria. And there's a smaller group of almost a quarter, they only went back 1 or 2 times, often, for reasons to go to the graveyard of, family and so on. So I think what I over-exaggerated my time, I'm sorry about that. Anyway, it's an important project for me. I think it's still going on, and I hope to work together with the museum one or the other day, because I'm sure you also have interviews of people who are covered there, and then it really gets a very broad perspective. Thank you.
So we have, if I can turn this on, there we go. We have some time for questions. I'm going to take prerogative and also at the same time walk down here because I see we don't have a microphone in the stand, so I'll go person to person. My first question, I have a second one if no one asks it, really concerns how the integration of Holocaust studies and refugee studies, and I would argue diaspora studies, can help with answering the question of who we are, right? It's one of the questions of the age. It's also one of the questions that scholars have been tackling really since the rise of National Socialism, how we frame our identities in our larger societies, in our larger national contexts. And you have, in the case of very few, but some Austrian Jewish multiple refugees and survivors of the Holocaust, really unique experiences. There are some Austrians who made their way to Poland in 1938, and then once the invasion of Poland happened, decided to go from Western Poland to Eastern Poland, usually around Bohemia or somewhere like near Bialystok. and then maybe made their way into the interior of the Soviet Union, ended up in Kazakhstan, and then emigrated to the United States in the 1990s. So you have people who were variously Jewish, Austrian, Polish, sort of, for a while, Soviets for a while, Kazakh, potentially. All of these overlapping identities through which there are certain cultural through lines. One could surmise the cultural through line being of an Austrian Jew. So, but there hasn't been much work on this. There hasn't been much work on these overlapping identities within the particular refugee context of the Holocaust. So that's my first question. I won't launch into the second one until we hear from the audience.
So should we take a stab at answering that?
Yeah, wait. That's the point.
I understand. So very briefly, because my colleagues also may wish to answer this question, in my work, I have explored, in fact, that question with people who were refugee Jews to many different countries. And oddly, or maybe not so oddly, the response has been that the overlapping identity between being an Austrian refugee Jew or a German refugee Jew or many other nationalities, that mapping onto another national context works most easily, according to the refugees, not to me, here in the United States. That it was easiest to have multiple identities here, easier even than, for example, in Palestine than Israel, or South Africa, or even Australia. That was a surprise to me. Yeah. So, okay, I will now leave it to my colleagues, and I will leave it also to you to ask other questions.
I think there is a point where refugee studies and the way we define ourselves sort of really come together. I think that there is a very wide misconception, at least in European societies as far as I can see, where the refugee is considered to be the exception. And this is a misconception that we have to fight against. This is a picture of the past that we have to basically replace by a more realistic picture. I will give you some examples. I come from an ethnically very varied region, but an important ethnic element in the province of Burgenland are Croatians. They come from former Dalmatia mostly. They came, and this we know exactly, in 1533 as refugees, fleeing from the Ottomans, advancing through the Balkans. They are very proud of their tradition, of their history, speaking Croatian till today, an antiquated dialect. The moment when you tell them that you were the refugees of the 16th century, this is not a version of the history that they want to hear, because their history is something of a heroic story of resettlement and keeping the tradition, but not of being a refugee. Austria, after the Second World War, had, on a population of 6 million roughly, 1.2 million refugees. Now there is a refugee crisis for you. Yeah? It's not a couple of 100,000, it's 1.2 million, it's 20% of the population. On top of that, mostly concentrated in the western provinces, so in the American and French zones, a little bit in the English as well, but not in the Soviet zone. Yeah? This is something that Austrian historiography is completely, or has for a long time, completely neglected. No, it has tried not to remember it, to disremember it, to negate it completely. Salzburg was a town of 50,000 before the war. After the war, it had a little bit reduced population, but on top of the original say 45,000, there were another 50,000 refugees in Salzburg or around the city, plus another 35,000 GIs, American GIs. Not a single stone in this city socially was left unturned. In the history of the city, this problem doesn't exist. It's not even mentioned. First research on this topic is studying now. This is a pattern that has been evolving, and we have completely forgotten about it, and we are not going into this. They were not all, and this we have to stress, refugees from war or persecution. They were what, and it's nearly a swear word in Austrian, they were so-called, partly at least, economic refugees. The word Wirtschaftsflüchtlinge, which has become nearly a very derogatory term because we can understand to a certain extent that people want to flee from persecution, but not because of their bad economic circumstances. So I think there again we have to campaign and make clear that there is not such a big difference fleeing from poverty and fleeing from persecution. These are gradual differences. And the last, I think, big difference that there is, and we fail to see that very often. We today, when we speak about refugees, we are talking about groups that are faced with a completely different situation. Refugees till the 1960s, 70s, when they arrived, the policy was to try to integrate them as quickly as possible, get them to work. Yeah? This is completely changed. Nobody wants to do this anymore in Europe. The policy is to put them somewhere into camps, not to give them a work permit, and to send them back to their origin as soon as possible. Refugees from the Yugoslav wars that have lived for 15, 18 years in northern and, say, Western European countries have been and are still sometimes sent back to countries like Macedonia, the Kosovo, etc., although they have managed to build up completely new lives, which are then completely destroyed by these resettlement programs. And the new refugees that arrive are left in complete limbo for years and years till their cases are being decided. I will end on this very absurd note. There is, for a refugee in Austria, waiting for his case to be decided, there is only one legal way of making money, and that is prostitution. It is not a trade for which you need a license, and it is not forbidden. You're not allowed to work. The only way is prostitution. And I think, as a society, if we don't want to see what we are doing here, we are really asking for trouble in creating these situations. And I think these are the really important things. We have to raise awareness of what is happening in the field of refugees nowadays. Thank you.
Okay, it's difficult to follow him because I think that was a very important political statement, and you see where we are in Austria. But I want to refer to what you said about the overlapping identities. I think about Holocaust and refugee studies, one of my important experience was when I was trained for the Shoah Foundation as an interviewer, which was really very interesting for me because I wanted to know how such a huge project is designed and works out and how interviewers are trained. But what I found interesting was this misconception that we in Austria mainly talk with survivors who could escape, not camp survivors. So the whole training was on camp survivors. And I thought, okay, you know that there are many bad interviews at the Shoah Foundation. And this was, for instance, one of the reasons, because you have to raise different questions. If somebody could escape, it's a different story. And, you know, there are so many specific stories as well. Anyway, this is one part of misconceptions and about overlapping identities. Well, from my interview experiences, and I think the linguistic strategies you mentioned before, this is sometimes just fascinating, the switch of language. For instance, if you interviewed a male survivor, and I think the most important moment of getting integrated into the American society was joining the army. I mean, this was the moment. And for me, it was also interesting that often during the interview, then the language turned from German into English. Okay, understandable, because you didn't learn the terminology for the army in German before, so you needed the language anyway. What about nostalgia? I mean, this is also about overlapping identities. As we heard before, this ambivalences, about you relate to this country, but you have, to separate it from that. So that's really a big thing you have to manage in your life. And from one of my favorite, as you mentioned, Salzburg, one of my favorite interviews was with the woman. She was born in the late 19th century from Salzburg, and she said she lived there, and people always ask her, why don't you go on holidays? And she said, why should I go on holidays? This is the most beautiful city in the world, so I don't go out from here. Well, she was expelled, so she could survive, and her family as well. And during the interview, and this is also one of the moments, she was very olden and, had closed eyes and was just, in her memory and could, very vividly tell. So she really took me to the street where she was living, and I love moments like this. And then she finally said, and this is a quotation our president used for the anniversary of the synagogue in Salzburg. So she said, Salzburg would be the most beautiful town of the world without the Salzburger, so without the people who lived there. And I think this gives you, identity overlapping.
Many times. Okay. I think we have perhaps time for one or two questions. Dr. Anthony?
My name is Paul Schatzberg. I just want to make first a quick comment to Albert Lichtblau about the Austrian Heritage Project associated with the Leo Baeck Institute. I was interviewed by two very nice Austrian gentlemen who came to my home, sat at the dinner table, and interviewed me for 4 hours. 4 hours continuously. They asked very good questions. But my question to the panel is this. What is the origin of anti-Semitism? And where shall we look for it? Now, I will look for it. I will tell you that in the Roman Catholic canon, there was a statement that the Jews are deicides. That means they murdered God. This was not removed until 1964 at Vatican II, presided over by John the 23rd. Now, these changes were resisted by the more conservative portions of the church, which is the case in Austria. Austria is a more conservative part of the church. And of course, it's also, when we look at the Christian part of the Bible, the most famous part to me is the book of Matthew, chapter 27. It's the famous scene of Pontius Pilate, where he says, what shall I do with Jesus? And the multitude on the square says, crucify him. And they said, but what has he done? Crucify him, they scream. And he washed his hands. But who was in the multitude? It was the Jews that were in the multitude. But it's not only the Roman Church. After the war, the Allies arrested several Methodist Lutheran ministers, arrested and tried and convicted them because they spoke publicly using their ministerial skills to support the activities of the Nazi German government.
Right.
I would like to comment on that, please.
If I may, it's not quite the subject of the panel, but I'd be happy to talk to you afterward and put in an early plug for my book, which
Well,
is
you can
History of
start a new
Anti-Semitism.
symposium, I suppose, but
Yeah.
I really would like the panel to respond on the point I've made.
I think that's fair, but perhaps if we have any questions that are specific to the refugee and Holocaust studies, let me see if we have any panel-specific questions first. I just want to give an opportunity to speak to the subject that's under discussion right now.
I'm David Jacobs. I'm a grandson of Joseph Lowenherz. My question, obviously the topic today is the Austrian refugees leaving. What are the odds of the Jewish population returning? There was a little bit of reference to it. I believe Mr. Lichtblau talked about 10% said they'd never go back, 25% said they would go back once but never go back again. We took my mother back 30-some years ago. She left in 38 after the Anschluss. I knew she was concerned that she would regret that she had left, and she was happy that she wasn't. So anyway, what do you think is the future for the Jewish population, Austria, and actually in the rest of the refugees that are now living in other parts of Europe?
I would like to jump in before my Austrian colleagues do to differentiate one piece. Ilana Offenberger spoke earlier about the number of Austrian Jews who were saved, most particularly by the efforts of the IKG. And I have noticed since then that many people talked about the Jewish community, the Viennese Jewish community that was saved. And what I want to point out is the obvious. The community was not saved at all. That community is lost and gone forever. Individual Jews, happily, individual Jews were saved. Their efforts were indeed successful, but not as a community. They joined other communities or chose not to join any at all.
At the end of 45, the Austrian Jewish community, the former proud and big Jewish community, had about 5,000 members, back from 200, almost 200,000, 180,000. At that time, nobody believed that that community could survive. Therefore, a lot of its archival material later on was sent to Israel, and it's now in the archives of Jewish heritage in Jerusalem. That's one point. The increase of the membership of the Jewish community in Vienna is less the returned refugees. There were very, very very little amount of persons who came back. Most of them, I think more than 90%, stayed abroad. That the Jewish community is still, and nowadays it's quite thriving. There were refugees from Eastern Europe, refugees who then fled the Polish pogroms, for instance. There were a lot of Jews coming from Poland to Austria in the aftermath of the war. There were Jews not really fleeing the pogroms, but fleeing the Stalinist regimes, which were founded there. So that today we have a large Russian community in the Jewish community in Vienna, and you have to add that there is the official Jewish community, the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde. Then there are ultra-Orthodox groups, especially Russian groups, Bukharische Juden, Jews of I don't know how you translate Bukharisch, from Eastern Europe. For them, the official Jewish community is too liberal. They won't join because of that. And you have, on the other hand, very liberal groups. For them, the Jewish community is too orthodox. So we have at least 3 to 4 different groups, not all of them, and the Jewish community has, I don't have the exact numbers, it's 8,000 to 10,000 members now, but the number of Jews in Vienna is estimated until 20,000. But the Jewish community was able to rebuild considerable infrastructures. There are Jewish schools in Vienna. There are Hakor, the famous Jewish sport club, is re-established and has nice places in the Prater. So there is Jewish life in Vienna, and especially in my home district, the second district of Vienna, the formerly very, very Jewish district. There is a lot of Orthodox Jewish life now, re-surviving. That's a picture of the present situation of the Jewish community.
Can I say a couple of sentences?
We have about 30 seconds, and then Albert would like to answer the first question.
Okay, then I back off.
Okay. 2 points about the Jewish community. Is the head of the Salzburg Jewish community is 106 years old, so this gives you an idea. And he's doing this job since the 1970s. About your question about religion, okay, this is an enormous question. But coming back to the questionnaires and interviews, what I think is really striking is that school was one of the main, spaces for anti-Semitism. And whenever kids learned in the Catholic religious instructions that Jews killed Jesus, they really got aggressive against the Jewish kids. There's one nice story, response, that the father of one of these boys went to the school and shouted to the head of the school, "Tell your children that Jesus was a Jew." Okay.
So with that, because we're not going to answer such an expansive question, I guess it is important to note that there are indicators today that kids who are educated in Roman Catholic schools in the United States actually have lower rates of anti-Semitism than children who receive secular education. That's a discussion for a much different forum, though. On that, we're going to conclude our panel because it is 6:32, and everyone needs to have dinner. Thank you very much for coming.